a new report is out today. What about the children? It sort of says what it on the tin, doesn't it? Which has been released by a variety of charities, campaign groups in this report. Really significant as we head towards the second module of the COVID-19 inquiry. I'm delighted to be joined in the studio by the directors of UsforThem, Molly Kingsley and Bella Skinner from UsforThem. A very good evening. Thanks for joining me in the studio. You've been involved in the production of this report. Just tell us about the key findings and what this sort of leads into in terms of the inquiry ahead. Bella, you kick off.
I think when you're talking about the inquiry, and this is the really important module, which is all about the issues around lockdown and the decisions made around MPIs and issues, actually, children were not going to be part of this. The core reason for this report is to actually say, hello, Baroness Howlett, why aren't you addressing the issues around children? Why isn't Gavin Williamson there? When you've looked at the report, it very clearly shows the issues around lockdown, the fact that children were not considered, the fact that things like playgrounds were locked up, the fact that we had no issues around outdoor transmission and yet children had to stay inside. Things like the rule of 2, rule of 6. But then you get onto the really big things around the educational issues that happened, as well as the horrific safeguarding problems that we saw.
Absolutely right. And Molly, some of the sort of the comments from children, from young people, I mean, utterly devastating. The one that really struck me was left on the edge and, just some devastating things, the mental health impact, the lack of education. And tell us about Sweden, because that's really important in this debate.
Yeah, I mean, Sweden is obviously used as a counterexample, isn't it? But it is very interesting with the children because Sweden, by and large, did not close their schools. It's not quite right to say there were no school closures. The older kids, 16, 17-year-olds, did do some remote learning. There were a few localised closures, but they had no prolonged mass closures. And guess what? There was no learning loss. So we know in the UK there has been very significant learning loss, particularly for already disadvantaged children. And what emerges from Sweden is there's no learning loss, and actually the disadvantaged children have not sunk further behind. So this inequity that really marred our own pandemic response is absent from the Swedish response.
But we've spoken about this a lot, and frankly, whenever I relook at this and I see these reports, I have to say the blood boils. It sends me steaming mad, because it was so blatantly obvious. And yet, as Anne Longfield, the former Children's Commissioner, she said children were put at the back of the queue. I mean, what's going on? Why did this happen? Well,
I think that's another question the inquiry have to answer and look at. Why did people feel it was almost impossible to speak out on this subject? We're one of the very few people who were speaking out and talking about it at the time. And everyone was seeing this issue. Everyone was seeing the impact that was happening on children. And we were seeing the social impacts, and we were seeing it being written. Sage talked about it. But no one was really brave enough to talk about it because people were sensitive. People felt very uncomfortable. So I think we need to be looking at why did people feel so uncomfortable about talking about something that's so fundamentally important.
Absolutely right. So, let's hear what the government spokesman at the Department of Education said. We asked them, they said, time in school is vital for a children's education, well-being and future life chances. Well, we know that. We know children were amongst those most affected by the pandemic, and we're helping them catch up academically as well as socially. And they talk about the multi-billions that are being poured into the recovery programme. I have to say, the other thing that drives me mad is when you get these mealy-mouthed government quotes that don't answer the question. What I want from the government is an apology that they actually got this wrong, and Sweden got it right.
I think an apology and action and funding, actually. So, the government so far have given about $4 billion in recovery funding. You might remember that at the height of the school closures, they appointed Sir Kevin Collins as recovery SAR. He estimated that $13.5 billion was needed. Now, this was an independent government-appointed expert, so they have given a fraction of the amount that was estimated as necessary, and that was before actually the full duration of closures. And what about a commitment to not do it again? So words are meaningless, words are very cheap. How about you actually sign into law one of the recommendations made in this report, which is schools to be designated essential infrastructure so they cannot be closed at the stroke of a minister's pen ever again.
Is there an alternative approach, almost like the government approach, that says actually we knew children were the least at risk. We knew that teachers, more elderly teachers, others were at risk, and they wanted to prevent the spread. And in a sense, they might almost say, and I feel like a heretic saying it, that actually it was an acceptable price for children to suffer that loss to protect others. I mean, is that their approach? Was that what they were thinking?
Well, you'd like to think that they actually had done a benefit and risk analysis to actually make that decision. There's no evidence they ever did a benefit and risk analysis to make that a decision, to even debate whether they were putting adults before children. And actually, what kind of society are we if we don't put children before adults?
I agree entirely. But do you trust, even if they put it into law, do you trust them second time round not to change their mind again?
So we have to look at, beyond children, the governance structures, the accountability structures. Here's an idea. Why don't we introduce criminal sanctions for failure to do a risk assessment? That might crystallise minds.
It might do, but of course, if you look before the pandemic, it was never part of the pre-pandemic planning to close schools. In fact, I think it was specifically said not to close schools, wasn't it?
Not quite that clear. Yeah, there was no plan for blanket school closures. That's definitely right.
Absolutely right. So we've got to learn that lesson. But the second module of the inquiry, children are not going to be represented so far. I mean, when are children going to be represented at this inquiry?
Well, that's a really good question. So Baroness Hallett, after the terms of reference came and they weren't actually including children, she has added children in. But the decision has been made that children will have their own separate module, which is actually called education. That hasn't been announced yet. The first 6 have been announced. So we're probably looking maybe starting late 25? Coming
25?
back 27? Yeah.
It's only 2023. I want this whole thing finished next year. I don't want to wait till 2025.
And all our children will have been grown up by then.
Unbelievable. Bella, Molly, you've done such sterling work. Thank you so much for what you're doing. Keep campaigning. We've got to keep battling on. We've got to keep advancing, keep succeeding. Thank you very much indeed.